Topic for the screencast is the generation gap discussion. Keep in mind that this screencast will make references to the screencast about the 20s. So when those slides come up, it will probably be a quick explanation or refer back to that particular screencast. If you want some additional resources or documentaries, feel free to take a look at some of these. If you're into video games, drive-in theaters, the decline of video rentals, store rentals, or movies, records, feel free to take a look at these documentaries here. I started off the screencast here with the song Stressed Out by the 21 Pilots because they have a chorus that addresses the golden age, and it's the golden age with regard to family. In class, you will be looking at these particular questions here, and each student should have a section where they are going to discuss their answers to the items here. So if you were section 1, 2, or in this case 3, the expectation is you have some understanding of these particular items. Why is this crucial? Because in order to address the main questions that are here, you have to think about all of these items collectively. So this lesson really started out with the game Guitar Hero. The song 1979 by the Smashing Pumpkins had come out in 1 year in Guitar Hero. The song was used as one of the games, the boards. People were upset. I went into YouTube and I looked at the comments, and it pretty much was a situation where people were saying things like, I'm only here because of this game. And then people were kind of offended. Like, how dare you destroy, the purity of what it was like growing up in the 90s. As you can see, this comment here, this song makes me miss the 90s. So that's kind of where this had come up with. So I want you to think about the connecting issues. And here we have some of the generations, which is another question here. What makes a generation? If you're looking for the answer to the question, generations usually get their names by, it could be an article, sometimes it's a book. And really it's about the collective experience of those particular items. What I want you to recognize here is that, there's a lot of similarities within the groups with regard to how they view the other. For example, Gen X, really not a fan of boomers, and definitely not going to be a fan of the group in front. Notice here that this is Gen Y and then Gen Z. Gen Y is actually the millennial generation. So the millennial generation was named by Strauss and Howe. And so this particular chart here is using this term. Another example would be Gen X. Another name could be 13ers. So those things kind of change, and you might have some conflicting information with regard to the dates as well as the specific names. For the most part, it shouldn't be too difficult to find some understanding. So I asked the question, should a first grader have a cell phone? And if you're thinking no, you are probably a member of Gen Z, and you are making a assumption about how the next generation coming after you should live. So what am I trying to get you to realize? I'm trying to get you to realize that the generation before you is probably going to be critical of you, and you will probably be critical of the generation coming after you. And so just something to think about, some of the similarities. So I asked the question, how is a member from another generation criticize you? And you should probably think about that. Here I am looking at the book Strauss and Howe called Generations. They're the author, Strauss and Howe. And they had come up with a pretty interesting analysis of generations. Notice how we have 4 generations here. This book was written in the 90s, so it really didn't have a name for this generation here, which is Gen Z, which is generation that you were probably from if you were born from 2001 to 2021. So Strauss and Howe have a fascinating theory where they look at a generation life cycle, which consists of 4 generations. So we see the 4 generations here. Each generation lives for about 20 years, and that entire generation's life cycle is 80 years. When we look at this particular chart here, notice how we have GI, silent, boomer. So the silent and the GI generation, that generation is part of the generation before this cycle. So this generation cycle, the millennial cycle, would consist of these 4 here: boomers, 13, millennials, and Gen Z. And what's interesting about Strauss and Howe is they look at generations, and they pretty much have been on point with looking at a crisis every 40 years as well as every 20 years. And in their book, they predicted that there would be a crisis in 2020. And think about where we are in 2020. And, you might want to go back and look at that particular book. I do have a section of it on my site under, I believe, the Vietnam tab or the 50s, 60s tab. So what they're arguing is that when you look at a generation life cycle, this first generation here and then this third, they have some things in common. And so if we're looking at the boomer cycle here, That generation that was born in the 40s, which is during World War II or after World War II with the baby boom generation. So they're like late 40s going into the early 60s. That was the group that fought the civil rights to change America. If you look at the millennials born, and their cycle ending in 2001, we can look at 9/11 as the crisis that that group encountered. So I know I mentioned 20 years and 40 years. Every 40 years, they would argue that there's a secular crisis and a spiritual awakening. And so the spiritual awakening was sort of like a Renaissance time period where society was really going to change. And that is a result of this boomer generation, which happens to be where the civil rights movement's at. So the civil rights movement, the boomers, they grew up during a spiritual awakening, and they were the generation that created a lot of the civil rights. The secular crisis over here, this generation, this was fought. This was the GI generation, and the secular crisis that they dealt with would be World War II. So we could throw like 9/11. We can throw COVID in this particular time frame over here, I guess. So I just try to get you to think about the generation life cycles. That's pretty fascinating. But the main point for this screencast is really to get you to think about a lot of the similarities between these generations and overall how we're possibly dealing with the same things. So if I ask you to critique first and second graders, maybe these would be some of the things that maybe you would say. Maybe you would have come up with something else. I don't know. Keep in mind, these are things that were said about the millennial generation. Over time, these are some of the criticisms of that particular generation. So think about what you would say about first and second graders. And if you came up with something for first and second graders, what just happened? Well, you have just become victim to the critique of the generation coming after you. So at this point, I'm going to transition to something called nostalgia. And, each generation has something to think about. I myself grew up in the 80s, and growing up in the 80s in the urban environment, you definitely were exposed to hip hop. I was a break dancer at one point in my life, and just to think about something as simple as laces, look at the laces and how they overlap. Traditional sneakers kind of go under and then they loop around. Well, if you were a break dancer, you would lace your sneakers up like this. Maybe you were somebody listening to rap music, and rap music used to have a message. Notice how I put over here mumble rappers? I kind of don't get today's rap. So I'm probably expressing something of a critique of the new generation of rappers in comparison to the generation that I grew up with, somewhere around this particular time period. Anyway, let's move on. So we're going to transition to the Roaring Twenties, and I want you to constantly think about the preservation, the people on the left, the people on the right that are just trying to stay true to what they are used to, which is why I use the example here. Some people would say something as stupid as laces. How dare you? You can't do that. You need to lace your laces up the way that we do. No, we're going to be, challenging you, so we don't want to do that. So we are going to develop our own lifestyle and our own cultural way of lacing up our sneakers, whatever. So let's move on. Here we have a passage from Fitzgerald, who is talking about in the Jazz Age his memories of growing up in the 20s. In the 20s, we talked about the Great Migration, the movement of African Americans, and how they brought their style, their way of dress, and everything. What about the immigrant groups coming in the 1920s that changed the way urban America was going to develop, and then suburban America was going to, emerge as a result of people trying to get out of the cities. Even something as simple as movies, which we talked about, the transition from silent movies into talkies and how that was resisted, how just shopping at a local store would become something of the past because department stores are starting to emerge, and that was really going to kill local merchants. And let's not forget about women and how women, are changing their style of dress. We've addressed some of these items, the vamps, the flappers, and how women were engaging in certain behaviors. Abortion, which was, a challenge to the four virtues for women seeking that. Even something with regard to religion and how we could teach creationism versus evolution, starting that particular debate. Well, in all of these situations, what's happening is the old generation is looking at the changes, and it's probably too much. So in this particular example here, growing up again in the 80s, which I'll do, I'll make a lot of references to the 80s. Oh boy, I could remember a time when we would go to the local video store and rent a movie, and it was great. Maybe it cost you $5, $80 for a membership. You needed to bring it back. I mean, look at this. This is American Ninja. I remember that film right there. American Ninja. This looks like Rambo. That's the third one against the Soviet. Oh, wow, look at this. Number 9, Sho Kazugi was in that thing. Anyway, you would go to the video store and you would watch it with your family. And so I can't really identify with the Netflix binge watching. Is it a result of the way, I was raised with this particular environment? Or is it really a result of something I just don't identify with? Or what about this? Maybe this is creating a new golden age. Maybe that'll be something that you will remember, when you're 30, 40 years old. Maybe movies will just be downloaded into our brain and you will be talking about, in your older age. I remember a time when we would just sit in a room and binge watch. All right, so you get the point of where I'm going with that. There's always a golden age, even a golden age of comics. You can look at comic books and comics. There was a golden age. There was a silver age, there was a decline, then there was the bronze age, like all types of stuff. There's always a golden age. What about Dungeons and Dragons in the 1980s when we would, elect a DM, a dungeon master, and that person would just kind of walk us through something that was in their mind that they had created? I'm sure if you are a Stranger Things fan, this is precisely what they were doing. Now you could just play a video game and you could kind of get some of that same visual, or you wouldn't even get the same visual because you would have to be able to have access to that individual who DM their brain and just don't have that capability. What about video games? How have they changed? I mean, the Atari 2600, this thing right here, this is a Pong game. The arcade, how the home video console system just destroyed the arcade industry. I mean, I'm looking at this arcade, I'm looking at that floor, I'm looking at the dark lighting, and I'm thinking, wow, that just really reminds me of arcade in the mall. Woodbridge Mall actually had two arcades. Spaceport, and the other one, the Game Room. Those were the two arcades that were in Woodbridge Mall. Sad that I remember that. What about this thing right here? This might be a reason why people are upset. If you were looking for research, if I was giving you an essay assignment, you would actually have to get this roll, and you would have to go to a magazine. This is a microfiche, and you would, let's say this is the New York Times, and this right here, you would put the New York Times on this reel, and then you would have to blow this thing up. And that's how you would get access to old stuff. Notice here where I put microfilm versus chase through. You probably could find the same information in about a 5-second Google search. Think about what's lost. Think about how that angers other people from the older generation. Think about the poem Nothing Gold Can Stay by Robert Frost. What are some of the things he's saying here? Talking about that golden age once again. Nothing gold can stay. Could also talk about cable, something as simple as that. I mean, before the 80s, late 70s, you were watching television, you had a limited amount of channels, and then cable would come out. This is actually a cable box that would hook up to your television, and you had these big old buttons, and you would have access to these channels. These channels led to the creation of MTV, and MTV was, music television, and they started to play music videos, which meant people in the music industry needed to figure out a way to also now be concerned about their appearance, which is why the Bugles made the song Video Killed the Radio Star. In that particular song, they were suggesting that as a result of videos now being a requirement for artists, that now the artist was going to have to change, some of the way they go about writing songs and some of the things they would now have to include. Here's an example of, let's just say your song was talking about how pretty you are. Well, if the image didn't fit the lyrics, that possibly would be problematic. I know beauty is a social construct. It depends on who's defining it, but just using it as an example here. What about this? The rise of software that can allow you to, make a song, and how that is possibly going to have some consequences for the music industry. Everybody is an artist. Hell, I could download some software right now and, make my own song of whatever. If you need an example of, I challenge you to look at this particular song and then figure out if this is actually somebody who is a legit artist. But just use this song. I haven't followed their career beyond there. Anyway, eventually the song Video Killed the Radio Star, they came up with another one. And they looked at machine and technology and how, that had become yet a change as well. Gen Z, so if we click those links, you would probably get some nasty things being said about millennials and Gen Z. So I'm trying to get you to think that the golden age is a powerful force. Now, we used the example before with regard to how the Nazis come to power, that golden age of the German Empire down here, and how the Nazis fought to preserve. There's always a group on the right trying to preserve the past, these preservationists. If we wanted to throw in ISIS in there, ISIS is the same thing. ISIS is trying to go back to the golden age of Islam. And so the golden age and this nostalgia is definitely a powerful force. Does everything have a golden age? I would argue definitely there's always a golden age, and that golden age is possibly a perception depending on the group that we are asking. So let's think about those questions that I asked at the beginning. That's it.